every election year, voters receive one ballot in August for the primary election and one in November for the general election. In the end, it's the winner of the general election that ultimately wins the race. So why do we bother with having a primary election in the first place? Well, the primary is held months before the general election to narrow down the candidates that will appear on the November ballot. And with Washington's unique top two primary, some might argue that it's more important to vote in the primary than in the general. In order to find out why that is, we are going to go talk to former Secretary of State Sam Reed, who is deeply involved in the creation of our primary process.
Some people favorably, some people unfavorably call me the father of the top two primary. I'm Sam Reed. I served as Secretary of State of the state of Washington from 2001 to 2013. The top two primary is unique in that the voters have a right to vote for the candidate, not the party in the primary. It's very important for young people to understand that if they're going to get a candidate to vote for in the general election who they really believe in, care about, and think would be the best office holder, they need to get involved in the primary.
But before we get into how the top two primary works, first we need to examine its origin. To do that, we need to go back almost 100 years to Washington's adoption of the blanket primary.
In the 1930s, the Grange and some other organizations put together an initiative to create the blanket primary. And the blanket primary made it possible, as you went in to vote in the primary, to go back and forth for different offices and vote for somebody of different parties. But at the end of it, the top vote getter in each party went ahead to the general election.
Everyone could vote, and you could vote for a Republican for governor and a Democrat for the Senate and back and forth, but there was a guaranteed spot on the ballot for a Republican and a Democrat. The Republican that got the most votes was on the ballot, and the Democrat who got the most votes was on the ballot.
The blanket primary represented the belief that Washington voters were inherently independent, and it empowered them to vote on issues and candidates regardless of party affiliation.
The parties always hated that system. It diminishes the party's ability to control its message and to control its name.
In the blanket primary, there was a reserved spot for each political party in the general election. And political parties want to be able to control who that candidate is, and thus their brand. So, if Democrats are free to vote for Republicans in the primary, and vice versa, those voters are basically involved with defining who the other party stands behind. As you might suspect, political parties found this problematic.
And then the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the California version of the blanket primary was unconstitutional. When I was elected state party chairman, the first thing we had to deal with was whether or not to join the Democrats in the lawsuit against the primary system.
Soon after, Washington's blanket primary was also found unconstitutional. So the 2004 legislature got to work on a new electoral structure, which advocated for a top two primary. Fearing their new top two primary would suffer the same fate as the blanket, they included a backup primary system in the bill.
Governor Locke used a lane item veto to eliminate the top two primary from the bill. And the legislature had built in what they called the Montana primary, where people don't have to identify which party they vote in, but they do have to vote by party.
For one election, I believe it was, we had a normal American primary, where Republicans had to vote for Republicans and Democrats had to vote for Democrats. That's how it is in most of the United States. But people hated that.
I had 16,000 emails sent to me, berating me, swearing at me, accusing me of being un-American. It was just
Before the legislature began on their fix for replacing the blanket primary, Sam Reed worked with the Grange on a Plan B. Plan B was to put an initiative before the voters on the fall ballot to implement the top two primary system.
So what happens is that the top two vote-getting candidates move into the general election rather than the top vote-getters in each party. So there was an initiative on the ballot in 2004 for the top two primary, and it was adopted overwhelmingly by the public.
So the government and the Grange and other groups said the way out of this is through the top two, and which is even for the parties worse, because there's no guaranteed spot for your candidate in November. And we opposed that, and we sued, and the lawsuits ended after I was chairman, but it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled that the top two primary is constitutional, because candidates don't actually run as a member of a party. They just list on the ballot which party they prefer.
People are allowed to choose what party they're going to belong to. They're not chosen by the party, which is the case in most other states.
And you can say anything. You know, I can say that I'm a member of the Barking Beagle Party. You can make it up, you know. And the Supreme Court said by doing that, it's not picking the party's nominees. So that's how we got here.
7-2 in our favor of the decision. So we were able to proceed with the 2008 general election with the top two primary, and that's what we've had since then.
But 20 years later, Washington is still only one of 4 other states with similar primaries. So, what is it about the top two primary that Washingtonians love so much?
The ideal behind a top two primary by the designers of it, I think, was to have the greatest possible participation in our democratic republic. And I think that's a pretty great reason.
The biggest benefit I see for the top two primary is that you're getting a person or persons who are best going to represent the people who are elected in that jurisdiction. I think that is very healthy for the process. You see in states where you have to be registered by party and the voters can only vote by party, you see more extreme people being elected, and frankly, you see party hacks being elected.
There are a lot of people that say that it's designed to create more moderate candidates in the general. That may be the case, but it's not always a result.
You know, I ran for the state Senate as an independent, partly because I believed the top two made it possible for an independent to make it to the final. I thought that voters were so mad at the two parties that they would support a centrist, moderate independent. But I now believe that there is no place in American politics for independents. We live in an era of negative partisanship. A lot of people are scared to death that if they vote for an independent, the party they hate, whichever one that is going to benefit. And there's so much partisanship that people feel like they have to support a Republican or a Democrat because they're scared to death of the other side winning.
We in Washington and across the country have really split into rural versus urban voters. And one party, the Republican Party, represents almost all the rural voters, and another party, the Democratic Party, represents almost all the urban voters.
You don't have any Republicans on the ballot in Seattle. You don't have very, very few Democrats on the ballot in Eastern Washington for most offices. And that's kind of a terrible thing, in my opinion.
The top two primary has worked very well for us for many, many years now. Sometimes there are two Democrats who make it through. Sometimes that means that there is a Democrat and a Republican, or two Republicans. But a lot of times in Washington state, it does mean that there are more Democrats who have an opportunity to make it to the general.
One of the concerns about the top two primary is that you could end up with people of the same party in the general election. And I had my concerns about it going in, but then my experience watching it was, it actually was a good thing for the voters. The parties that control certain districts, they were being challenged by somebody in their own party, and it was very healthy because what we saw tended to be more moderate candidates versus more, the Republicans more conservative, Democrats more liberal candidates. And it ended up being a little more of a dialogue, a little bit more of something that the voters were able to chew on. And I thought it was very healthy for our democracy.
I think it's time to run through some hypothetical scenarios with some simplified math for ease of understanding. Scenario 1. Let's start with a local election. As we've heard, rural districts tend to vote more Republican, let's say 70% or so. So, in a top two primary election with 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat running, let's say each Republican receives about 35% of the vote, and the remaining 30% goes to the Democrat. In this scenario, the 2 Republicans would make it to the general election. This could also happen in urban legislative districts with 2 Democrats making it to the general election. Now, let's think statewide. Statewide elections are less politically lopsided. For purposes of easy math, in the last general election, it was about 60% Democratic voters versus 40% Republican voters. Scenario 2. Statewide election with 2 Democrats, 1 Republican. In this scenario, the 2 Democrats would each get about 30% of the votes. And if the Republican in the race can capture all the likely Republican votes, they would be the top vote getter in the primary election with about 40%. And the other 2 candidates would vie for the second place finish, enacting strategies that would result in, let's say 1 Democrat getting 25% and 1 getting 35%. This would result in 1 Republican and 1 Democrat making it to the general election ballot. Scenario 3, the dreaded crowded primary race. In this hypothetical scenario, there are 4 Democratic candidates for a statewide office and 2 Republicans in the primary. Because Washington historically has been a majority Democratic state, one would assume that at least 1 Democrat would make it to the general election. However, in this scenario, something called vote splitting could happen. Each of the 4 Democrats could get about 15% of the votes. The 2 Republicans could each get 20% of the vote, resulting in 2 Republicans on the ballot in the general election. This is something that the majority party fears in any election. Too many candidates in the primary splitting the votes. In order to fulfill the vision of the top two primary system, Washington voters have a lot to pay attention to when filling out their primary ballot. First, determine how many candidates are running in a particular race. Second, who are the individual candidates? Third, what are those candidates' specific policies? And lastly, know what party the candidate prefers and check to see who they have been endorsed by. By doing these simple steps, voters can align with the spirit behind the top two primary, which is to focus on the individual candidate and not just their political party.
That is what democracy is all about. Being able to get the right people in the right office at the right time to do what you care about, what you feel is important. And so I encourage young people throughout the state of Washington to get involved, get engaged in this process, and utilize this outstanding primary system that we have.